How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the Taped Podcast, the most wuthering podcast in the world. We are your hosts, as always, myself, MickyT.
And me, Nostalgia.
And welcome back to another edition of the Worst to Best series, the classic. And we're always joined by a guest on the Worst to Best series, but we have a returning guest this time. Big friend of the podcast channel, of the cassette tape generally, one of our great patrons as well, and generally just a bit of a fucking legend. Welcome back, Koner One.
Hey.
Hello,
Woo!
I'm back.
Welcome back. It's been a long time since you've been on. What was the last one you were on? Actually, now that I think about it,
I think it was Daft Punk.
Oh damn!
that was like well over a year ago. I think
I think you guys decided immediately after they broke up that you wanted the next episode to be them. So I think they met them 2 years at this point.
Wait,
Maybe.
that's right. It's been a long time since they broke up. Holy.
Oh my god.
All right. Well, we're not talking about Daft Punk here.
Yeah, of course. Away from Daft Punk now. Away from Two Funny Robots. In case you weren't aware already, we're doing a little worst to best for the one, the only Kate Bush. And this has been a long time coming. This one has been a long time coming.
Let's go.
I think this was like one that we set out to do like 2 years ago, but we never actually got around to doing it. That is criminal, to be honest. And we just won't waste any more time. We'll just get right into our rankings. So, ready to go?
Yeah, but just quick note: we won't be including director's cut since it has no real original material, even though it technically is a studio album.
Yeah. Okay, so we have 9 albums in our rankings, and starting off obviously at number 9. In my opinion, Kate Bush's worst album is The Red Shoes.
My number 9 pick is 50 Words for Snow.
My worst Kate Bush album, or least good, is The Red Shoes.
Okay, I will go last.
No, you go first. I want you to explain this to me.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, we're starting off with Kate's most recent album, and I use that word quite loosely because this year marks this album's 12-year anniversary. But 50 Words for Snow is certainly, I guess, one of the most interesting albums in Kate Bush's discography concept-wise when you're looking at it as one big unit. I will give it that, as the album is centered around a theme of falling snow, and its overall approach is incredibly slow-paced, incredibly focused in building atmospheres, specifically snowy and wintry ones, and incredibly ambitious with 2 of the only 10-minute plus tracks Kate Bush have ever released appearing back-to-back on here. And while I can see the artistic vision here, I can definitely picture the snowy and nocturnal soundscapes that are built around me throughout this album. And I can definitely appreciate this album's approach. I just think there ultimately isn't quite enough for me to latch on throughout. As for a runtime of over an hour, this project has just somewhat fades into background noise every time I listen to it. Even after consecutive listens, there's not that many tracks that are truly memorable to me. I'm not going to stand here and say it's a bad album, nor do I think that Kate Bush didn't succeed with her approach here. But for me, it's just a bit too slow, a bit too uneventful, and it certainly is the album I'm itching the least to return to from her discography. It's definitely not an album that feels like it should be at the bottom of any sort of rankings, and for any other artist it would most certainly not be bottom, but in this case it's the worst pick of the bunch for me.
Alright, now that we got the cringe worst pick out of the way, let's move on to the 2 best ones. And I chose The Red Shoes. The Red Shoes isn't a very unpopular pick that people make for Kate Bush's weakest album. For me, I agree with that sentiment, but even then, The Red Shoes is an okay album that has some great highlights, just not very consistent ones, in my opinion. You know, in a lot of respects, the main reason why The Red Shoes doesn't do much for me is because it's just not really doing much that reinvents the wheel in the context of Kate Bush's discography, which, is constantly trying to reinvent itself and do something different, even in Kate's later years. And in comparison with her other works, it's just severely underwhelming in my opinion. It doesn't do anything bad per se, but it just doesn't do much that's interesting consistently or engaging consistently. Some tracks might start off pretty decent, but as they go on, they get really repetitive and really boring, and unfortunately there's not much that can be done to bring much excitement, as they kind of just fade out and do nothing else in my opinion. Like, they're serviceable tunes mostly, and there's never a moment in my opinion that's outright bad, apart from Big Stripey Lie, but we'll get to that. But it's just, I wish that there was more to what Kate Bush was trying to do on here. Production wise, this album is nowhere near as great as it was in the albums that are ahead of it in the ranking. I feel like it's underwhelming in terms of songwriting, and while Kate Bush still sounds fantastic, she can't really save the album from the often standard instrumental choices. Also, the album is fairly long-winded in my opinion. I don't think it's interesting enough to be 55 minutes long, and while Kate Bush has made 2 albums that come after it that are longer, it feels like the longest album out of those 3 because it just isn't that overly interesting for me. But even then, like I said, there's some great tracks in the album scattered in here. There's some good contributions from Prince on And So Is Love, which is fantastic by the way, and it's pretty much an alright listen. But it just feels like a tired listen for me and an easy choice for her weakest album. And I don't have much else to say besides that.
Yeah, so I also have it in my worst spot, and I just want to say, make sure that you guys tag this YouTube video with hashtag Stranger Things to help the algorithm.
We're a few months late to really get the algorithm on our side here.
I mean, who
That
knows?
is
People
true.
are hyped for maybe people are hyped for the new season, but like that could help.
That's
I'm not.
not for another 2 years, isn't it?
Really? Oh shit! I didn't know.
Something like that. I
knows.
don't know.
Christ.
You take their
But
time.
yeah. So I'm pretty much just gonna be piggybacking off what Mickey said, but I'll just read my notes anyways. So yeah, picking the Red Shoes I don't think is a very controversial take, but I think it's her least good album. I don't think she has any bad ones, but I think that this one just doesn't live up to the benchmark that she set with her previous releases. Part of me kind of feels icky for saying that. One, because I can't write music at all, and 2, because the 90s were a pretty difficult decade for her. Jesus, I just misgendered Kate Bush.
Oh wow. Is that a first?
It might be a first.
Oh my god. Wow.
Wow. All right, I gotta disconnect. See you in the next episode. All
You
right.
disconnected?
But yeah, I'll continue on after that blunder. But yeah, just a lot of personal loss. And the album's kind of a flop. So the next few years after the release of this weren't very easy for her. But just with that said, the album is just okay. There's one great song. There's a couple of good ones, and the majority of them are just kind of average. I think the latter is due to a few reasons. The first being that production-wise, they have next to no quirks, which I think is one of Kate's trademarks. And in addition to that, sometimes some of the songwriting ideas are questionable. All in all, I don't think there is much to really get riled up over about the Red Shoes. I think it's just a small misstep in an otherwise brilliant catalog. But I'm just glad that she took the time off she deserved, got better, and came back over a decade later with a fantastic comeback album.
All right. And with that in mind, my favorite tracks from the Red Shoes are And So Is Love, Moments of Pleasure, and The Red Shoes, which I think is actually a really underrated song in Kate's whole discography. And my least favorite track is Big Stripey Lie. Not very fond of that one.
My favorite track on 50 Words for Snow is the title track. My least favorite track is Among Angels.
My favorite tracks from the Red Shoes are Moments of Pleasure and Rubber Band Girl, and my least favorite is Eat the Music.
All right, and with that in mind, moving on to our number 8 picks, and I chose Lionheart.
I also chose Lionheart.
Sorry about that. I forgot what I picked. I picked Lionheart.
All right.
Woo, the triple stack.
Normal order, so.
All right. Kate Bush's sophomore album is one that's often glanced over in the context of her discography. Not because it's a bad album or anything, but when compared to the rest of her albums, people see it as one of her least essential albums. And for me, I definitely agree with that sentiment, but it shouldn't be written off like that, as there's quality material on Lionheart. Some tracks even stand out as like some of my favorite Kate Bush tracks, I won't even lie. Lionheart came very quickly after The Kick Inside came out, and because The Kick Inside was such a smash hit, A quick follow-up is honestly not surprising. But that kind of rushed feel is definitely present on some tracks here. Even then, Kate Bush's quote-unquote rushed material is better than so many other artists' rushed material. It's not even funny. Like, it's obvious in every aspect here, vocals, production, songwriting, you name it, and there's rarely a bad song on it, and the best tracks are honestly incredible, like Symphony in Blue and Wow especially. Just wow. And even the tracks that aren't so memorable are carried massively by Kate's life-giving vocals. Where the album falls short really is in its memorability. Apart from one lackluster song, the latter half of the album is a bit uninteresting and unmemorable when compared to the first. But even then, the songs themselves are still very solid at the very least. It's definitely a more tame album as well when we consider the way it paces itself as well now. And now that I think about it, as well as that, there isn't really too much else to say about Lionheart. If you heard the kick inside, then there'll be no surprises for you on this. But yeah, that's all I really have to say about it.
Yeah, again, same album. There is one thing that almost all Kate Bush albums have in common. It's the fact that a lot of them are clearly labours of time and love. However, there is a bit of an outlier amongst her discography, and that is her sophomore album, Lionheart. It was released mere months after her massively successful debut, and Lionheart was basically just rushed out the door by EMI, who wanted Bush to immediately capitalise on the success of that debut with more of the same. So Bush quickly finalised some ideas that were conceived during the 3-year-long recording process for that debut album, added 2, I believe, brand new tracks into the mix, and the end result is Lionheart. And while in a lot of cases a label pushing an artist to release an album just to capitalise on the buzz results in some very, very poor projects, this isn't really the case with Lionheart. I still think that overall this album is very good. It's very often similar to what she presented on her debut, nonetheless elevated by the same great songwriting, the same great vocal work, the same great arrangements that Bush had become so well known for at the time. And just like you said, Mick, the track Wow is easily one of her best songs ever. But it's the track run between In the Warm Room and Coffee Home Ground where, in my opinion, the rushed nature of the album does show its head. None of those tracks are bad per se, but they largely feel like a prog pop pastiche from an artist as groundbreaking as Bush, and only several months after her wonderful debut. That really does make it extra disappointing. However, ultimately, I still think it's a great album that showcases her obvious talents, and those talents are more than enough to save the album. And yeah, again, overall, I think it has a lot more good tracks than bad. It has some incredible moments, but it definitely could have used a bit more time in the oven. And if it did get that, then perhaps it would be just as iconic as her debut. We'll never know.
Yeah, so I pretty much ripped off the Wikipedia page for this album for writing these notes. But I think those circumstances of the release of this album in some way excuse maybe the fact that it missed the mark compared to her debut. I don't think it's a poor follow-up by any means, but like you guys said, I guess when you learn the reasoning why it came out, it kind of makes sense that it's not fully formed. There's some amazing songs here, like the ones that you guys mentioned already, like Wow. And I'm just thinking about that Family Guy episode with Stewie and that song. And now the song is partially ruined.
Wait,
I don't know anything about it. Keep talking. I don't want to know about it.
What the fuck?
I don't want to know.
Save that for the end, I suppose.
Okay, yeah, let me know.
Yeah, but there's some amazing songs. There's some good ones. But I think overall it just doesn't really warrant a lot of re-listens. Overall, I'd say it's a decent follow-up. But there's definitely clear signs that it could have been better had she been given more time to work on it, particularly on the production side of things. There's some meh tracks in the back end of the track listing, like Nostalgia said, and I don't think it flows as well as some of her other albums, but if you like what you heard on the Kick Inside and you wanted more of that, you'll find plenty to like here. I honestly think that it's not even a case of the production. I think these are songs that, if given the choice, she probably would have chosen not to release them to the public. But I don't know. That's a hypothetical, but that's what I'm thinking. But yeah, those are my thoughts.
Yeah.
Okay then. All right, with that in mind, my favorite tracks from Lionheart are Symphony in Blue, Wow, and England My Lionheart. My least favorite track is Coffee Home Ground.
My favorite tracks are Symphony in Blue, Wow, and Don't Push Your Foot on That Heartbreak. And my least favorite track is also Coffee Home Ground.
Based.
Okay. My favorite songs are Symphony in Blue, and I'm not going to try to do the falsetto. My other favorite is Wow. And my least favorite is Coffee Home Ground.
Hey, the triple threat. Okay, with that in mind, we're moving on to the number 7 picks. Oh, Jesus, I'm afraid to say this now. Okay, my number 7 pick is The Kick Inside.
Whoa. My number 7 pick is Ariel.
My number 7 pick is 50 Words for Snow.
I just like the little huh like you said after I said that. Oh my god.
Yeah, it was just registering.
Now before I talk here, I want to preface this. This is where all the great shit starts coming in my list. This is just personal preference. Thank you. Yeah, The Kick Inside, Kate Bush's debut album. It's one hell of an introduction for the then 19-year-old singer. You know, at the time it kind of blew everyone away given how sophisticated, unique, and just utterly breathtaking she was as a singer, and the music she was making was genuinely breathtaking as well, especially some of the most famous songs off The Kick Inside. You know, for me, it isn't one of my personal favorites in her discography, as you can tell, but it's still a really good record, and it's definitely an important record for Kate as her introduction. I mean, for starters, the record subtly hints at what ideas and sounds and that other records would be following suit with, while it isn't blatantly as progressive as other records in her discography. There is those progressive undertones there. It can be found in some sections of the instrumentals. She obviously would explore that avenue further down the road, but you can see the ambition is slowly but surely creeping its way in. Even then, there's just a lot of ambition on this record vocally. You know, Kate Bush is, you know, incredibly unique vocalist to say the least, and the kinds of melodies she was incorporating on this album were just nuts for someone who was working on these songs since she was a teenager, pretty much. You know, who would have guessed that Kate Bush was a good singer? The album is produced well. It has a lot of really good choices in the production with some Baroque instrumentation and some piano rock tracks. The album's peaks are just phenomenal when the production matches Kate's incredible vocals, and there are some fantastic instrumentals on here to say the least. Not to mention, the personal songwriting is also fantastic as well, which at points adds to the songs and Kate's already passionate vocals. Plus, some of Kate's most essential songs appear in this album, like Moving, The Man with the Child in His Eyes, and of course, the monumental Wuthering Heights. My only gripes with the album are that, in comparison with her later works, The Kick Inside is fairly standard for Kate Bush, musically speaking, but like, this is still fairly ambitious for what it is. You know, not to say that it isn't ambitious at all, because it is pretty ambitious. But her later music did become more great and ambitious, leaving The Kick Inside as a kind of springboard to take things further. You know, there's only one track I don't like in this album, which is kind of the hokey piano rock of Kite, but the rest of the album, at the very least, is good. And while I do very much enjoy the album, I don't think it is one of Kate's more memorable albums, aside from the obvious standouts. Aside from that, this record is really good. Please don't murder me.
Okay. Yeah, so my number 7 pick was 50 Words for Snow. So 3 things that I'll say off the bat is, 1, I think the album is a little bit long-winded. 2 is that I really only throw it on unless it's the winter, for obvious reasons. And number 3, I completely understand why somebody might put it as their least favorite. So I'm not going to bite your head off, nostalgia. So don't have to worry.
Thank you.
When it comes to not wanting to listen to this unless it's winter, I mean that in the most positive way possible, because this album nails the winter vibe better than most others that I can think of. The Kate Bush that made this and the Kate Bush that made, say, like The Dreaming are completely different people. If you're expecting nutty shit on here, too bad. The only thing you get is a song about fucking a snowman.
Yeah, that's not nutty.
It's also Elton John on here as well, which I think is kind of cool. I'm not going to make the jokes that I was thinking of making about him, so we're going to just keep going. The trend of not testing the limits of her voice anymore that began on Ariel continues here to an even further degree. But I honestly don't think that her like falsetto vocal runs would match the instrumentation here, like, at all. The album aims for a very, very specific vibe, and I can definitely see why some people might not get a lot of mileage out of it. And like I said before, I find that I appreciate its mission statement more than I choose to revisit it. It's a good record, though. I definitely hope that it's not her last either.
Of course.
I went with Ariel, which again, please don't murder me, guys. I really like this album. In fact, everything here is great. Everything starting here is great. If you thought the 6-year gap in albums between this project and 50 Words for Snow, it was long, then what did I just write? I don't know what I wrote. I think my maths is off. Well, anyways, this album came after a 12-year hiatus. That's definitely what I was getting at. And expectations during that time were quite obviously just brewing and brewing. It was at the time the longest hiatus that Kate had ever taken, even though she might very well overtake that soon. And expectations were massive. Everyone was on the edge of their seat when she finally started releasing singles and a new album run had begun. And were those expectations met? For the most part, yes, but also in a way, not really. Ariel is long. It's a fair bit longer than anything else in her discography, clocking it at 1 hour and 19 minutes. And if we are to talk about the project's weak points real quick, just to get those out of the way before the praise kicks in, I don't think its track list fully justifies being 1 hour and 19 minutes long. It has a lot of incredible moments throughout, that if maybe 1 or 2 or 3 were cut from the mix, I don't think it would affect the album in any negative way. In fact, I do think it would make the overall listening experience of this album that little bit less daunting, which at this moment for me, it honestly is a little bit of a daunting album to revisit. It's not one that I'm excited to revisit, even though I have a few times in preparation for this video, mostly because it's just that long, and there are just a number of tracks, especially in the middle first half of the album, where they just don't do too much for me. They don't really stand out. I can't really recall a lot of their motifs or any of their aspects from memory, and I do ultimately think the album would have been better without it. However, there's a big caveat. The tracks that are good, which there is quite a lot of, are absolutely incredible. There's masterpieces all throughout this album, like How to Be Invisible, Nocturne, Ariel. It just, the beauty of just Kate Bush's voice over these minimal, slow burning, oftentimes incorporating birdsong and natural elements. The beauty of her voice in this environment is just absolutely incredible. And again, I can't understate just how amazing those moments are and how much I've been coming back to those tracks. But overall, it is just the length and those few tracks in the middle that don't really do much for me that bring this album down as a whole. Not a lot. I still very much love this album, but it's about margins here when we're talking about Kate Bush's discography, because there's just so many albums that I absolutely love.
Of course. And with that in mind, my favorite tracks from the Kick Inside are Moving, Wuthering Heights, and L'Amour Looks Like You. My least favorite track is Kite.
My favorite tracks on Ariel are How to Be Invisible, Nocturne, and Ariel. My least favorite track is Miss Bartolozzi.
My favorite tracks on 50 Words for Snow are Snowflake and Wildman. And my least favorite song is Among Angels. I'm going to break from the format and just add my album scores moving forward. So I give this album a 74. So just let's decide to start throwing those in just for the hell of it.
All right, fair enough. I will confirm that the next album in my ranking is first 8 on the list. So, yeah. With that in mind, moving on to our number 6 picks, and I chose 50 Words for Snow.
I chose The Red Shoes.
I chose Ariel.
All right then.
Standard order.
Sorry?
Standard order.
All right, fair enough. 50 Words for Snow. You know, at the time of recording this podcast, 50 Words for Snow is the latest album that Kate Bush has released, and it's almost reaching the point where it will be the longest Kate has been in studio silence. But at the time, 50 Words for Snow came out 6 years after Ariel, and 50 Words for Snow, much like Ariel, is a very unique album in Kate Bush's discography, and it's another great addition to her discography for me, and I've been thoroughly enjoying this album. I could definitely say this album is excuse me, sorry. I could definitely say this album probably might put people off because obviously it's pacing, it's definitely very slow burning, and as well as that, there isn't a single song in this album that isn't under the 6 minute mark. In fact, most are between 7 to 10 minutes. But a lot of it just works for me, and I genuinely find this album to be gorgeous and fulfilling from front to back. It's a very seasonal album, obviously, given the the mission statement of the album and the intention behind it. But I really do think it's something I might actually come back to more often than just the winter, to be honest. The music on this album very much suits the title and the cover. It's a very wintry kind of album. Basically wintry fairy tale-esque, and Kate does it justice with brilliant songwriting and brilliant vocals. There's even some great duets across this album with Elton John and even Kate's own son in the opening track, which is a gorgeous track. The album as a whole is soundtrack-esque, backed merely by strings and piano most of the time, and it's quite the somber backdrop for Kate, and honestly, I loved it. Sure, it's not as groundbreaking or as iconic as other works, but for me, it does what it sets out to do and does it well, and I think that Kate's vision really does work throughout with some of her coldest yet beautiful material. Each Kate Bush album will offer something different. 50 Words for Snow is probably one of her most different records, and I think that it's a fantastic one. Not my personal favorite or anything, sorry, excuse me, but one that I admire, and I think it's great. I loved Snowflake, I loved Misty, I loved Snowden at Wheeler Street, I loved Among Angels. I basically loved going through the whole album, and while yes, it's long, I think it's worth it, and if I haven't said it enough, it's beautiful. There's only one track that I'm not fond of, but aside from that, the rest of 50 Words for Snow is gorgeous, in my opinion. I think the album is fantastic, and if this was to be the last ever Kate Bush album, I would be fairly satisfied with this being her final ever offering for us, to be honest. But, yeah. Yeah, I hope it's not the last offering, please. Kate Bush, drop something, please, I beg.
Right, I went with The Red Shoes. The album that both of you agreed was the worst Kate Bush album, and I don't think it's unpopular to say that you would be in quite popular company. It is by quite some margin the lowest rated Kate Bush album on Radio Music, and also by quite some margin the one with the least amount of ratings. So I had quite reserved expectations going into it upon first listen, and at first I have to admit those were somewhat meh. I never disliked the album or anything it has to offer, far from it, but upon first listen it definitely did strike me as quite a bit worse than what I had heard from her up until that point. With one of the most striking things for me being the fact that it sees Bush, who had by then established herself as a constantly forward-thinking artist, tackle a more new wave influenced and pop rock sound that, if anything, was a few years too late, given the project came out in late 1993 and sounds honestly straight out of the late 80s. But when it comes to its production, its songwriting, it's something which, despite this album growing on me massively, spoiler alert, I still believe to be true. I still do think that a lot of her ideas and the overall sound of this album is a little dated for 1993. But after several listens, something just shifted in my brain. I thought, both the 80s and the 90s are long gone, and I don't really need to judge it for what it might have been received like 30 years ago. I can judge it as it is right now, which obviously everything from the 80s is dated by today's standards. And the more I listened to this album, the more I just began to grow attached to its many, many songs. I honestly think this is a great album. It's flawed, sure, but it's just from start to finish great nonetheless, and I think it's a worthy addition to her discography. In Kate's own words, The Red Shoes was intended to be a more straightforward rocker instrumentally, and Bush wanted to put a lot of her studio and production trickery on the back foot in favor of an album that could more easily be toured and performed with a band, a live band. And while the tour she alluded to was never materialized, the album we get is still one which I can appreciate for that reason, for its accessibility instrumentally and for trying something new as far as her music was to be concerned, with contributions from the likes of Prince, Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, rest in peace. It is perhaps Bush's most immediate album, filled with plenty of rock drums, bombastic performances, guitar solos, the whole lot. And while it is a little bit spotty, especially in the latter half, this album is above all else for me just pure fun. Released during a time of great hardship and just sorrow for Bush, between a breakup, bereavements. It feels like a bit of an escape, especially on tracks like Eat Your Music, which are just so vibrant, so colourful, so in your face. Sure, this album is a bit of an outlier in Kate Bush's discography overall, and while I can see why it's not remembered as fondly as a lot of her classic albums, I still think it's a wonderful project, and just something about it keeps me coming back to it. And the individual tracks on here, I just keep coming back to. I can't help myself.
Seek help.
No.
Well, you know what you said. You know what they say. You can't eat your music and rate it too. Yeah. So number 6, I have. Holy shit! It's the OK Computer of Birdsong. So I'm only a third of the way through my ranking at this point, and I'm already in the 8 out of 10 range. So I can only imagine that everyone in England collectively spilled their tea on their undergarments at the news of a new Kate Bush album 12 years after the last one. Dropping a double album after such a long break and after an album that generally didn't do that well is a ballsy-ass move. And in my opinion, it's one that totally sticks to the landing. The second half of this album is essentially a 42-minute suite. And I think that pretty comfortably surpasses the quality of the first half of the record. But even then, the first half is fantastic. Nowhere else can you get a song reciting the digits of pi and a stunning tribute to a maternity figure on the same disc. So that's impressive. But I think the second disc is really where this record shines in particular. I think the second disc is otherworldly, to be honest, especially the last 5 tracks. I think Sunset is honestly a top 10 Kate Bush track for me. And yeah, in the grand scheme of things, the bird song on Ariel is just merely an anecdote musically, but it definitely fits well into the nature theme present throughout the record. Sure, other records in her catalog are more ambitious from a production standpoint, but Ariel is still quite ambitious for a comeback record, and it's a great comeback record at that.
All right. With that in mind, my favorite tracks from 50 Words for Snow are Snowflake, Snowed In at Wheeler Street, and Among Angels. My least favorite track is 50 Words for Snow.
My favorite tracks on The Red Shoes are Rubber Band Girl, Eat the Music, and Moments of Pleasure. And worst track, I agree with you, Mick, Big Stripey Lie.
Yeah, we can finally agree on something.
My favorite tracks on Ariel are King of the Mountain, Sunset, Nocturne, and the title track. And my least favorite track is also Mrs. Bartolozzi.
All right, and we're moving into the top 5. And with that in mind, my number 5 pick is The Sensual World.
My number 5 pick is Never Forever.
My number 5 pick is also The Sensual World.
Based? Oh my god.
I shall go last.
No, you go first.
Alright, I'll go first. We usually have the outlier go last, Nick.
Well, I'm not doing it this time. This is
right,
a different
right.
episode now. This is a different cassette tape.
Never Forever is a pivotal moment in Kate's career, being the first project that she would produce herself. And the fact that she was now basically responsible for every single aspect of her sound and her music, her creativity and artistic expression only blossomed and grew in wild and adventurous directions. Never Forever immediately opens up with the iconic Babushka, a track that again presents Bush's riveting songwriting and storytelling in a way that's more explosive than ever before. And from there on, the track listing doesn't get any less diverse and eclectic, with heavy influences taken from prog rock, glam rock, baroque music, folk, and everything in between, all delivered with that Kate Bush charm and magic indicative of her first two albums. And while I don't quite think it reaches the creative peaks of some of her later self-produced works, it's still got so many iconic moments. It feels like such an ecstatic release of Kate's creativity from start to finish that there's really nothing I can fault this album on. It's merely down here by virtue of just being slightly less amazing than some amazing records, but it's a fantastic album with some incredible highlights.
Alright, and with that in mind, I chose The Sensual World. The Sensual World is often seen as like the final album in the golden age of Kate Bush's discography, and it had a lot to follow up on when it was coming out about 4 years after Hounds of Love. And from my perspective, it's definitely an album that doesn't disappoint as a follow-up, and while it isn't her best, it's an absolutely fantastic album. I think up to this point, sonic consistency and cohesiveness has not really been something that Kate Bush implemented into many of her albums, as most of her albums up to this point threw so many ideas in terms of sonic directions and weird vocals around the place. But The Sensual World is a bit of a shift from that, as it's an album that feels like it's one consistent sonic vein and maintains a similar pattern as it goes. That doesn't take away from the album fully, but the unpredictability of what we typically expect in a Kate Bush album isn't really here. It definitely makes The Sensual World unique in her discography, and generally, it's a pretty damn great album all in all, and it has some fantastic tracks. In terms of its production and songwriting, it's simply great. The album's lyrics thematically centered more around sensuality and relationships, and Kate manages to match with the vocals that are more kind of hushed in comparison with what she did before. And the production is fantastic as well, with ideas and a palette that gives some kind of sophisti-pop vibes at points. Plus there's plenty of folky inclusions, which Kate has been no stranger to at this point, but they are woven into the palette with great cohesiveness, and they blend perfectly with whatever else is going on. The songs in this album, while not as unique, unpredictable, and as incredibly standout as typical Kate Bush highlights would be, are still great to listen to. There's some fantastic moments in here, like the title track Love and Anger. The bass work on the track is incredible, and the guitar work from David Gilmour is great too. Never Be Mine and This Woman's Work are also fantastic tracks, and there's some great deep cuts here. Plus, I've generally got no complaints for anything involving production, vocals, or songwriting, as it's all top tier. The only complaint that I do have is it mostly has to do with the replay value. I definitely see myself coming back to it, but I think as far as individual tracks go, there's only maybe a few that I would actually go back to outside of the context of the album, because I feel like as a cohesive unit, they work way better. Aside from that, the material on this album is great. There's lots of fantastic tracks in this thing, and despite it only being 5th on my list, it's a fantastic album. Who would have guessed? Kate Bush made fantastic music.
Yeah. So my number 5 pick was also the album that Mick just picked. For some reason, I don't really know how to describe this record for myself. It's really difficult to talk about it without mentioning that it's the follow-up to her most successful album, and I think that fact alone immediately puts it at a disadvantage, because it's not fair to have to follow up something like a insert album that I'll talk about later here. But with that said, on its own merits, this is a really fucking good album. Pardon my French. So I think the first half is a little bit better than the second, but this album definitely does end with her most emotionally potent song, in my opinion. I really like the more atmospheric moments, like the opening title track as well as the fog. But for me, it's actually the more bombastic moments that really do it for me, even though there's not really that many of them. Case in point is the second half of Rocket's Tale. Goddamn, dude. It's really nice to see David Gilmour actually contributing something of worth in the 80s. Am I right? I've heard her sing weird stories in her songs before, but I think Head to Her Dancing, where a woman accidentally dances with Hitler all night, really probably takes the cake for me. I don't really have much else to say, though. She definitely capped off the 80s on a high note, and just in general, the 80s for her was a top 10 decade long run for any artist ever, in my opinion.
Is that it? All right. And with that in mind, my favorite tracks from The Sensual World are Love and Anger, deeper understanding in this woman's work. If I had to pick a least favorite, it would be The Fog.
My favorite tracks on Never Forever are Babushka, The Wedding List, and Breathing. I do not have any least favorites.
My favorite tracks on The Central World are the title track, Love and Anger, Rocket's Tale, This Woman's Work, and The Fog, which I didn't have written down, but that's one of my favorites. And my least favorite is Between a Man and a Woman, and I give this record an 84.
Epico. And with that in mind, we're moving on to our number 4 picks, and I chose Never Forever.
I chose The Kick Inside.
I also chose The Kick Inside.
And now I'm the
No,
outlier,
Mick,
but we're
go
going in
first.
standard order. Hey, I get to do it to you because I always go first. All right. So, Never Forever is, for me at least, the first great album in Kate Bush's discography by going chronologically. I know a lot will disagree with me, but I still like The Kick Inside. Don't fucking murder me. And it's also an album that feels like a turning point for her, and it's really taking key steps towards some of Kate's more outstanding albums. At the same time, it's a really quality album that has some strong Kate Bush songs to its name. It feels like a turning point as the music itself has embraced a sense of maturity. The theatrics of previous records still show up, but then again, it wouldn't be Kate Bush without great theatrics. But there are moments where she set aside that style in favor of something a bit more stripped back. Stripped back in that it's not often over the top, but rather more tame in comparison. And that gives way to some of Kate Bush's smartest songs and some of her most well done songwriting. In fact, the songwriting is really one of the strongest parts of this album, especially moments like Army Dreamers and the dystopian Breathing, and even fun tracks like Babushka and The Wedding List. Some tracks are a bit more slow burning, but they really, exceed by the ethereal nature of them. And when I say that, I mean that. Especially Egypt and Delius, which I adored from this album. Even then, there's so many fun bangers like the aforementioned Babushka, which is, still my favorite Kate Bush track. I won't even lie. I'd argue this album is transitional in Kate's discography, but as it's a bit all over the place in what it tries to do. But even then, I just think it's really consistent. It's really great from front to back, and I just enjoy it thoroughly with every listen that I give it. It's definitely a top 5 album in her discography for me, and it goes without saying that Kate Bush sounds amazing on this album too. It's an uneven album for sure, but I just loved a lot of the tracks from it. I'm basing it just off of how much that I enjoyed the tracks alone. And even if there are a couple of songs that I don't think are that amazing, the great tracks on here really do carry it for me. And it's just, those great tracks really do stand out to me. Like, say, when we're comparing it to The Sensual World, even though that album is great too. But yeah, with that in mind, I really love Never Forever. I think it's fantastic. And yeah, it's good.
Right, I went with her debut, The Kick Inside. Kate Bush's debut album is one that's equal parts fascinating and impressive. Everything about this album, from its sophisticated and elegant instrumentation to the vividly descriptive and mature songwriting, all the way to Kate's almost ghost-like vocals and sheer control she has over her voice, even on the most experimental vocal passages. To an oblivious listener, it all suggests that The Kick Inside was the product of a veteran at work. But in fact, it was the product of an up-and-coming artist still in her teenage years. One Catherine Bush, who would over the next decade effortlessly establish herself as one of the most important voices in popular music history. A girl power icon for the ages, a genius the likes of which pop music will forever owe so much to. It all started here. Oftentimes when talking about debut albums from legendary artists, there is an element of setting a foundation and the artist finding their feet. But as I already mentioned, none of that is really present here. If you look at this album on face value, Kate, at only 19 years old, had already burst onto the scene with a sound that was not only refined, but ahead of its time in so many ways, and delivered with unrivaled poise and grace. Lyrically exploring themes of love, womanhood, sexuality, with a maturity and confidence far beyond her years. The Kate Bush on The Kick Inside, while presented through beautifully poetic songwriting and off-kilter performances, is unapologetically herself. And Kate Bush being herself is again nothing short of genius, a visionary and an icon. I will say though, the when looking at this album in the grand scheme of her discography, even though it may not seem like it on first listen, there was a room to grow. Although at the time it may not have seemed like it. It may have seemed like this was already as impressive as it could possibly get. Kate Bush would only get better from here, and that's the only really thing that brings this album down. The fact that its ideas, its foundation was in fact expanded on.
Yeah. My fourth pick was her debut as well. So I personally gave up on the belief that I could write and produce music a very long time ago, and yet I'm still envious beyond belief that anybody could make this at the age of 19. It's just bewildering to me. Even more bewildering is that a lot of these songs were written when she was like 13, 14, 15, like etc. Right from the get-go, the Kick Inside boasts some genuinely amazing songs, particularly on the first half. And the track listing is also very versatile as well. You've got a song that's wise beyond Kate's years in A Man with a Child in His Eyes. And you also have the kick-ass rocker of James and the Cold Gun, which I'll talk a little bit more about at the end. And then, of course, you have Wuthering Heights, which, like, how is that your first single? How?
For real.
Like, yeah, I don't get it. But yeah, I love that there's like an unofficial like Wuthering Heights Day where people like gather in the field and like recreate the music video. It's great. An absolute masterpiece of a song. And I also take that moment to actually give props to our session musicians. I forget his name, but the guy who played the guitar solo on that song that I just mentioned is a legend. And he is apparently annoyed that it was so low in the mix, which is pretty funny. And you've also got to give it to David Gilmour for helping put her on the map. No matter how hard I try to think about this album in a critical sense, all I can muster, again, is holy fuck, she was a teenager. I just want to point out that the live at the Hammersmith Odeon live performance, which came from one of the only 2 tours that she did, is really fantastic, and I think it's definitely recommended for anybody who might be on the fence about this record. But I definitely think that's worth watching because it's a great way to see the magic of this album in action.
All right. Now, with that in mind, my favorite tracks from Never Forever are Babushka, Egypt, and Breathing. If I had to pick a least favorite, it would be Night Scented Stock.
My favorite tracks on Kick Inside are Wuthering Heights, Oh to Be in Love, and Them Heavy People, and I do not have any least favorites.
My favorite songs on the Kick Inside are Moving, Wuthering Heights, James and the Cold Gun, Them Heavy People, Oh to Be in Love, Man with a Child in His Eyes, and my least favorite is Room for the Life. And I give this record an 86 out of 100, so we're in the great territory.
Of course. And yeah, with that in mind, we're moving on to the top 3. And for me, my number 3 pick is Aerials.
My number 3 pick is The Dreaming.
Ooh, I thought you would have had that at least 2.
It's been at several moments at number 2. My number 2 and 3 picks, I've swapped them like 14 times. Every time I listen to one, I move it up to 2.
I think Mick's System of a Down part of his brain just turned on for a second when he called it Aerials. My number 3 pick. My number 3 pick is Never Forever.
God, you're right. Okay, Ariel then. Ariel. I gotta get that in my brain. Ariel. Gotcha. You know, Ariel arrived. Shut up. Alright, Ariel arrived in 2005 after Kate Bush took a hiatus from music. You know, in between that, starting a family while continuously working on what we now know as Ariel now, it was the longest gap in studio releases from Kate Bush as of recording this. And for me, it's simply fantastic. It's one of the most unique albums that Kate Bush has ever made. And Ariel is simply just transcendental for me. I absolutely love this album. You know, Ariel comes off like, to me, like the record that Kate Bush wanted to make. It's not trying to wow or do anything bombastic, but rather It feels like it wants to be its own tranquil, indulgent thing, and it succeeds in doing so for me, as the material on this thing is gorgeous. It's definitely an indulgent album, but indulgence isn't always a bad thing, and in Kate Bush's case, it's quite the opposite. It's split into two halves, like Hounds of Love. One half is the more accessible side, and the other is the more out there side. But the first half is a series of like these ambient pop tracks that are pacing themselves and relying on building an atmosphere. And the second half is a full-on 40-minute suite of just it's just pure bliss, and it's amazing to me. I think Kate brings forth more strong songwriting on some tracks, some of her strongest even, with some interesting ideas and just beautiful odes to Kate's son and mother lyrically. Kate herself is, of course, incredible across the board, and I really appreciate the approach that the instrumentalists take, which is very much low-key and unassuming. Not to mention, it is produced immaculately. It's hard to even put into words, but the album just sounds brilliant on almost every level. It's just an absolute, just beautiful, blissful, just a beautiful, blissful album that I can never get enough. I'm stumbling over myself because I can't think of descriptors. But yeah, I adore A Sky of Honey. It's just a great suite that you can get lost in. Like, it legit turns into Birdsong at one point, and I just absolutely adore it. Every section of it is incredible. Tracks on the other side, though, like Bertie, Pie, Joannie, and A Choral Room are among some of the best tracks that Kate Bush has ever made for me. And this was an album that was just an amazing ethereal ride from front to back. I loved getting lost in what was going on, and I appreciate it as one of Kate's most unique and brilliant works. I barely even have many criticisms for it. I just really adored what was going on here from front to back. I can totally understand why some people wouldn't put it in a top 3, or maybe think it's a bit long-winded, but I genuinely never got those criticisms like while I was listening through this album, because I genuinely adored it. I thought it was blissful. I was getting lost in it. I loved it. Don't have much else to say aside from that. I love it. It's great. What more needs to be said?
Now, I went with The Dreaming, Kate's 4th, I believe, album, if I'm counting correctly. If never have I ever, what? Never forever,
what the fuck are you saying?
Never Forever. Her first self-produced album was a creative jump for Kate Bush. The Dreaming was a skydive off a cliff. It was her most off-kilter, unusual, and experimental project to date, filled with ideas and soundscapes that not only upon release, but still to this day, sound like nothing else. And for an artist as commercially successful as Bush was in the UK, it's no surprise that the initial reaction for a lot of people was mild confusion due to just how wacky this project is. But dear God, time has been so kind to this album. In the decades since its release, it's grown to be one of the most acclaimed albums in her discography and influenced countless of artists from Bjork to Steven Wilson to Big Boy of Outkast. This album, while largely still carried by Bush's incredible storytelling and songwriting as well as her production virtuosity, presents a more just at the same time subtle yet also just completely off the wall approach instrumentally. It plays with these more lush, more vibrant instrumentals that on the same time present a more erratic yet playful approach to Bush's overall sound, or her approach, her delivery. 40 years later, this album still stands as a breath of fresh air when it comes to pop. Its production and combination of digital and analog sounds is strikingly modern, yet it still sounds unlike anything I've ever heard. It's incredible. I think it's Kate Bush at her most unchained, and in a lot of ways at her most brave. Incredible album.
Okay. So my number 3 is Never Forever. So before I started writing notes for this episode, this album actually barely made it into my top 5. And as it stands today, it just barely beats out the record that I just talked about. So this record begins the beginning of Kate Bush producing her own material single-handedly, and it definitely shows. It's also the album where her knack for writing pop songs that are progressive in nature begins to become apparent. This specifically comes across in songs like Egypt and Breathing, which both end in completely different places from where they begin. I'm a huge fan of James and the Colgan, like I said before, from her debut. So I'm more than happy that there's a few songs in the track listing that carry that song's torch. The album never dulls in quality, in my opinion, except for maybe tracks 8 and 9, but just marginally. Still, the album ends on a very high note with the incredible 1-2 punch of Army Dreamers, which is another song that I'm surprised she was wise enough to write at her age, and Breathing, which I just mentioned. I would liken this record. I would say that Never Forever is the metal to Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, in the sense that it serves as a very important stepping stone to what she's going to release next, which I'm about to get to. But yeah, from here on out, there is nothing but pure brilliance, in my opinion, in this discography. And this is the last album of hers that I would put in the 8 out of 10 range.
Of course. And yeah, with that in mind, my favorite tracks from Ariel, I said it right now, Ariel, are Birdie, A Coral Room, and An Endless Sky of Honey. I have no least favorite tracks.
My favorite tracks on The Dreaming are There Goes a Tenor, Pull Out the Pin, and Night of the Swallows, and I have no least favorite tracks.
Favorite songs on Never Forever: Babushka, The Wedding List, Army Dreamers, and Breathing. And my least favorite, if I exclude that one like 50-second interlude, is The Infant Kiss.
All right, now we're in the final 2 albums in the rankings. And yeah, my number 2 pick is The Dreaming.
My number 2 pick is The Sensual World.
My number 2 pick, Mick and I are kindred spirits, is The Dreaming.
Yes. Thank you, Conor.
Does this mean I have to go first again?
Yes.
Or how are we doing this? All right. The Sensual World to me is an album which completely embodies the word magnificent. It's incredibly beautiful. It's equal parts subtle and expansive, and delivered with even more grace and maturity than all of its predecessors. The Sensual World, it sees Kate yet again embark on an odyssey through eclectic and forward-thinking influences and ideas, while containing them all in an album that is overall far less off the wall with its compositions, instead favouring a slow-burning, sophisticated, and largely serene approach. And while the more unpredictable and eccentric ideas found all throughout the likes of Hounds of Love, The Dreaming, never fail to blow me away, The Sensual World proves that Kate can be just as forward-thinking and progressive with her sound and influences, while simultaneously creating something more mature and elegant overall. This album largely centers around Kate's vocals and songwriting, with the majority of her performances on here being quite hushed, introspective, and spine-tinglingly beautiful. Her voice constantly being complemented by her equally as impressive production and arrangements, utilizing flavors and instruments from all over Europe and indeed the world, all equating to the lush and sophisticated compositions, all of which beautifully work alongside Kate's spacious and elegant productions, all of which just completely blow me away every single time I listen to this project. And this album, while revered by many, especially Kate Bush fan, I think far too often gets overlooked by its predecessors. Do think that it follows the streak of greatness that albums like Hounds of Love and The Dreaming represent. I think it's, if not better, on par with those projects. Obviously, in my opinion, it's better. And it, well, not better than Hounds of Love. What did I just say?
Wrong.
Obviously,
Wrong.
It's not the best album, but I do think
Correct.
it's better than the likes of The Dreaming. I do
Wrong.
think it's better than the likes of Never Forever.
Correct.
It's just such an incredible project. It never
Actually, no,
fails
wrong.
to blow
What
me
am I
away.
saying?
And this woman's work is probably in my top 3 favorite Kate Bush songs. That song is just so beautiful. It's probably one of the most beautiful pieces of music ever created.
I failed the funny. I had a brain rot moment there for a second.
I had a brain rot moment as well. I've been having a few.
Okay. But yeah, with that in mind, I chose The Dreaming. Leave society. Return to donkey. As I'm sure most people are aware, The Dreaming was one of Kate Bush's most polarizing albums in her discography, as the album itself was misunderstood for years and panned by critics when it initially came out. Since then, it's received a massive reevaluation, and it's often considered one of the most forward-thinking art pop albums of all time. The latter of that is very true, and for me, The Dreaming is one of Kate Bush's finest works to date, among her very best even. The reason why The Dreaming was so polarizing at the time was because of how odd the album is. At points, odd is putting it lightly as well, because what Kate aimed to do on this album was create something that was not like anything else at the time, and I can't really think of anything that sounds quite like it, because there really isn't anything like it. It's an uncompromising album as far as its ideas go, and it's far from the first Kate Bush album you should listen to if you were to get into her music. But when you do listen to it, I feel like it'll be the most rewarding one, as each time I've gone to The Dreaming, I've come back from it with new niche details and other things to note from it, and it's that dense. So yeah, challenging is one way to put it. The album being her She's Gone Mad album is just a perfect descriptor, because it genuinely sounds like that. And what makes this album all the more impressive for me is that Kate had full creative control and production control of the record. It's her vision only, and it truly shows how much of an innovative creative she was. The Dreaming features very eccentric and strange and quirky and avant-garde instrumentals that are often quite surreal, and it's Kate arranged and produced this herself, and they're equally matched by just as eccentric and out there vocal performances. The tracks in here are just chaotic, wild, beyond theatrical. The album is truly unpredictable, and even when it's not trying to be eccentric, it's hauntingly beautiful at points, particularly in the last set of tracks like All the Love and Houdini. I love the fact that Kate Bush just does so much strange work with her vocals all over this album, and the instrumentals match whatever she's trying to do vocally. And as a result, we get some of her weirdest and wildest tracks ever, some of which are some of her most interesting and challenging. There's really only one track that I'm not crazy about. The rest of it is fantastic. I'm enamored by what Kate Bush produced on this album, and while it sucks that this album was met with puzzlement when it came out, we did end up getting Hounds of Love out of it, so that's a W. So all in all, The Dreaming, it's fantastic. It's an absolute beast of an album. It's a league of its own, and it's one of the most ambitious art pop records one could ever hear. It's that fantastic.
Okay. Yeah, I'm in the same boat as Mickey. My second favorite album by Kate Bush is The Dreaming. And I know this might sound absolutely insane, but I was not convinced of this album's brilliance at first. Can you possibly believe it? It took a few,
how could you?
It took a few listens for this album to click fully. But now that I have spent a lot of time with it, I can say that this is a superb album. I think that Mike the Snare described this album perfectly by saying it's an album that refuses to meet you halfway. I couldn't agree with him more on that. It's going to have you completely disoriented within the first 30 seconds, which at first might be off-putting, like it was for me, but it's eventually going to grow on you. There's odd writing choices and even odder production choices at every turn, and there isn't a single song on here that doesn't have me flabbergasted at least once. It would be wrong to say that The Dreaming is some obtuse, impenetrable fortress of weird. However, sure, like there's wacky moments, like the donkey wailing on the closer, or the indigenous Australian instrumentation of the title track. But there are also moments of straightforward pop wonder too, like Suspended in Gaffa, which is a top 5 Kate Bush track for me, and other songs like The Night of the Swallow as well, which while progressive are easy enough to follow in structure. The latter track takes cues from Irish folk music, which she would revisit on her next record as well. There's plenty of other noteworthy moments too, but I'm just gonna save those for a full review at some point. But overall, The Dreaming is a super dense record that definitely holds up today. My opinion, their best is still to come, and I think that the music world just wasn't ready for this album at the time. And I think that's why it's kind of like Kid A, where people didn't know what to think about it at first, and they come to love it. So, yeah.
Hard agree. And yeah, with that in mind, my favorite tracks from The Dreaming are Pull Out the Pin, Suspended in Gaffa, and All the Love. If I had to pick a least favorite, it would have to be There Goes a Tenor. I apologize.
That track is so good, but okay. Best tracks on The Sensual World are Love and Anger, Rocket's Tale, and This Woman's Work. I do not have any least favorite track.
My favorite tracks on The Dreaming are Sat in Your Lap, There Goes the Tenor, which always reminds me of that Wallace and Gromit short film where they're like the wrong trousers, where he's like the penguins controlling the suit in the art museum or whatever. It always reminds me of that. Suspended in the Gaffa, like I mentioned, Night of the Swallow, and Get Out of My House. With that last one, I feel like the donkey noises are not as out of nowhere once you like understand the lyrical metaphors in that song, but it is still a weird moment. And my least favorite, which is still a good song, is All the Love.
Wallace and Gromit fucking slaps, bro.
True, it does.
I almost said Wallace and Gromit. Okay.
Wallet, bro.
Wallet. We forgot the money, Gromit. But yeah, now we're moving on to our number one picks. And now I want us to all say in unison when I count us in, okay?
Discord might have other plans, but we'll try.
Yeah, it's probably not going to work.
Fuck it, we'll do it anyway, because it'll be picked up in Audacity. 3, 2, 1, The Red Shoes. You fuckers.
I
didn't say anything because I forgot what we were doing for a second. I was so tired.
You fuckers. But no. If it wasn't obvious already, it's Hounds of Love.
Actually, it's Mark Radcliffe talks with Kate Bush. The interview album.
Oh god.
It's Sound of Love. What else would it be?
Yeah, exactly. Miho, go first.
Okay.
I'm only joking. I'm going first.
Okay.
Actually, no, I wasn't.
How about I go first?
I didn't have my notes open yet.
Actually, no, go first.
Then I just closed them again. Okay. All right. Am I going first?
No.
Okay, what you're about to say is final. Am I going first?
Yes.
All right. Hounds of Love, my favorite Kate Bush album. Surprise, surprise. This was most certainly one of the easiest selections for a top pick that I've ever had to make, which is a bit odd and is not me disregarding her discography in the slightest, but overall it's just a testament to the sheer quality of Hounds of Love. This project is a masterpiece. It's an album that perfectly represents its era while still sounding absolutely incredible to this day. It's an album that perfectly represents Kate Bush as an artist and presents every single aspect that makes her so unique, so special, so wonderful, all in one package. And it's also an album that represents the best of pop music, period. It stretched the idea of what pop music can be. It stretched it to its creative limits while retaining every bit of mainstream and commercial appeal one would expect from the genre, largely helped by its wonderful synth-pop stylings, which capture the zeitgeist of the mid-'80s through the lens of a visionary. A visionary whose work reverbs throughout pop music and music at large to this day. Kate Bush sits, in my opinion, elegantly on the throne of pop music. She is my queen of pop and always will be, and Hounds of Love is the crowning achievement. What I find to be the most striking thing about this project is that despite the crazy experimentation, the ideas present throughout, the eclectic soundscapes and influences, the unorthodox album flow, the sheer uniqueness of it all, despite all of that, Hounds of Love is effortlessly accessible. It remains universal. It remains easy to fall in love with. Just look at the success of Running Up That Hill just last year. Decades after its release, the moment people caught on, it just clicked with so many people. The magic, the haunting beauty in Kate's voice and songwriting, how she brings her wild and wonderful ideas to life with, to this day, unmatched production style and composition. It all adds to something quite simply timeless, and Hounds of Love is the epitome of that. I could ramble on about how special this album is for hours. Everyone already knows it though, and you know it's a masterpiece. It's pop music at its best, and if you haven't listened to this project, honestly, I think you're lucky as fuck, because the things I would do to listen to it for the first time again, man, just listen to it.
Agreed. So yeah, if it wasn't blatantly obvious, Hounds of Love is an obvious pick for number one. I mean, it's Hounds of Love. It's one of the greatest pop albums of all time, and it's truly a testament to Kate Bush's prowess as an artist. It's sort of a no-brainer for number one, really, and even outside of its acclaim, the music on Hounds of Love is incredible, and it has everything that makes Kate Bush amazing, but done to her very best with some of her very best material. You know, Hounds of Love, simply put, is incredible. Kate divides it into two distinct sides, and the first half is more, straightforward sounding, and the second half is more, distinctly artsy and experimental in approach. And both sides of the album know what they are, they serve their purpose, and in turn create some phenomenal material. The first half contains some of the greatest pop songs you will probably ever hear. The timeless Running Up That Hill, the Big Sky, Cloud Busting, and Dream of Sheep. And the sheer quality of these songs speak for themselves because some of them act as some of Kate Bush's best works ever. It's the more accessible side of the album for sure, and the second half is just like a surreal fever dream because there's just some weird inclusions like Waking the Witch, which throws in a lot of like weird ideas and theatrics. There's the Jig of Life, which throws in some trad Irish influences, hey, and even there's gorgeous moments like Hello Earth. It does a great job generally of balancing the accessible with the weird, and all while remaining just incredible and unique. Not to mention, this album has aged gracefully. It's definitely an album from the 80s for sure, but the thing is, what Kate does on this album distinguishes itself from whatever her contemporaries were doing, and in turn it makes it come off as unique and timeless. Plus, if it wasn't clear already, these songs stood the test of time and remain incredible to this day. Like, obviously you referenced last year when Running Up That Hill gained more and more popularity. People from like a newer generation are checking out this song, and people are fucking loving it, and it's clearly showing. Of course, it goes without saying, Kate Bush sounds phenomenal on this album. The production is fantastic. I mean, Kate Bush had her hands all over this thing, so of course it's fantastic, and it still sounds like it. The songwriting is incredible. I mean, Running Up That Hill has is probably one of the most potent songs of all time, and one of the best written songs of all time too. So, it's a given. Plus, as an album, it's probably the most rewarding to come away from. The Dreaming, of course, is an album that's rewarding because of how challenging it is. But for me, you're simply getting more from Hounds of Love, and I probably would be coming back to it. And I probably would be coming back to this more than The Dreaming. So yeah, masterpiece.
Yeah. Yeah. When you said masterpiece, and my audio just like broke that word up into like 500 different pieces.
Oh, my bad.
But yes. So number one for me, Hounds of Love. So for the longest time, this is only Kate Bush album that I'd listened to, and I'd have to say that the time between doing that and going into the rest of her discography was a bleak time in my life. I'm so glad that I discovered Kate Bush and dove as far into her work as I have, because she's one of my favorite artists of all time now. And I know this is the album that started that love. So when I first reviewed this album in 2020, for its 35th anniversary, I called it great, but by no means a masterpiece. I want to go back in time and kick my former self off a bridge. A couple years later, I changed my mind. I'm going to go and call this my favorite album of the 80s after a record that I will not mention because Mick will get mad. But with that said, Kate Bush delivered what just might be the greatest A-side in the history of pop music and a marvel of storytelling on the B-side. For me, I think the key to the falling head over heels for this record was having an aha moment when the second half of the album clicked. The way that she crafts a narrative using so many different sonic palettes is nothing short of amazing. But overall, Hounds of Love is an experience from front to back, rivaled by only a few select albums that I can think of. My praise for this album is about as derivative as Greta Van Fleet, and I really just can't think of I can't think of anything to say that just hasn't been already said. Yeah, I think that the popularity that Running Up That Hill, jeez, I'm getting my hills confused. The popularity that got from Stranger Things, I couldn't be more happy about that. Quite a few things bothered me about the latest season of that show, but that song was used perfectly from a narrative perspective. And the hype that she got stateside from that was long overdue, considering what she's contributed to music in her career so far. But the favorite for me is Cloud Busting, and that's my favorite Kate Bush song, and I'm gonna say that's the top 25. That's a top 25 track all time. I'm not apologizing for that. Hounds of Love is romantic, anxious, passionate, and at times suspenseful. And all around, it's one of the most memorable pop experiences I've ever had in my life. It is without a doubt the best pop album of the 80s for me. And yeah, that's my list.
All right. And with that in mind, my favorite tracks from Hounds of Love are Running Up That Hill, Cloud Busting, and Jig of Life. If I had to pick a least favorite, I wouldn't pick any of them because there are no least favorites.
Let's go. My favorite tracks on Hounds of Love are Running Up That Hill, The Big Sky, and Cloud Busting, my favorite Kate Bush song as well. And I do not have any least favorites.
My favorite tracks on Hounds of Love are Running Up That Hill, A Deal with God. Apparently, A Deal with God was supposed to be the only title for the song, but they're like, that's going to be too political. You can't do that. So she had to add.
You can't do that.
So she had to, change the name a little bit. We got the title track, The Big Sky, Cloud Busting, as I mentioned, and Dream of Sheep, and The Morning Fog. And my least favorite, if I had to pick one, would be Hello Earth. But I love all of them. So
damn. I thought we'd all have none on this one. Fuck's sake.
That's like the least 10 out of 10 song on the album. So that's how good this album is. Like, I don't know. And
fair.
This album is obviously a fucking 100. Like,
fair enough. And with that in mind, that concludes the episode. We fucking
Let's
did
go.
it. Yeah.
Let's go.
Thanks for coming on. Thanks so much for coming on again, Connor. It's always a pleasure to have you on, my friend.
Of course. I think we went through this pretty fast, considering.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I remember
someone just fell down the stairs here. What the fuck was that?
What?
I think Audacity might have picked that up. What the fuck?
What the fuck?
What?
I heard a loud crashing outside my room, and I'll investigate it in a minute.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, I'll get the outro done so you can do some investigating. All right. So, thank you all so much for checking out today's episode of the Taped Podcast. We really hope that you enjoyed. Once again, thank you so much, Connor, for coming on. It was a pleasure as always. In
thank
the
you for
comment section
having me.
below, yeah, of course. In the comment section below, please be sure to leave your Kate Bush rankings and let us know who you agreed with the most and who you disagreed with the most. We want some engagement. Give us some engagement. And and yeah, with that in mind, links in the description to our Discord server. You can chat with us as well as other like-minded individuals. You can check out the Patreon if you would like to support our content. We do live streams often, so subscribe to get notified about those. Of course, our Rate Your Music and Album of the Year pages are in the description as well. And with that in mind, my name is MickyT.
I've been Nostalgia.
I've been Connor 1.
See ya!
I love life. Pull out the
And I will be back whenever we eventually do PJ Harvey.
Noted.